Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more Esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Mrs. Helena Blavatsky. This is the secret doctrine we are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It's not the format for everyone, but people seem to find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material and the link for my book, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of the secret doctrine with our giants of fiction. Here, again, we come into collision with science. The latter denies so far that man has ever been much larger than the average of the tall and powerful men one meets with occasionally now. Dr. Henry Gregor denounces such traditions as resting upon ill-digested facts. Instances of mistaken judgments are brought forward. Thus, in 1613, in a locality called from time immemorial the Field of Giants in the Lower Dauphiné, France, 4 miles from Saint-Romain, enormous bones were found deeply buried in the sandy soil. These were attributed to human remains and even to Teutobochus, the Teuton chief slain by Marius. But Cuvier's later research proved them to be the fossil remains of the Dinotherium giganteum of the family of tapirs, 18 feet long. Ancient buildings are pointed to as evidence that our earliest ancestors were not much larger than we are, the entrance of doors being of no larger size then than they are now. The tallest man of antiquity, known to us, was the Roman Emperor Maximus, we are told, whose height was only 7.5 feet. Nevertheless, in our modern day, we see every year men taller than this. The Hungarian who exhibited himself in the London Pavilion was nearly 9 feet high. In America, a giant was shown 9.5 feet tall. The Montenegrin Danilo was 8 feet 7 inches. In Russia and Germany, one often sees men in the lower classes above 7 feet. And, as the ape theorists are told by Mr. Darwin, that the species of animal which results from crossbreeding always betray a tendency to revert to the original type, they ought to apply the same law to men. Had there been no giants as a rule in ancient days, there would be none now. All this applies only to the historic period, and if the skeletons in the prehistoric ages have failed so far, which is positively denied, to prove undeniably in the opinion of science the claim here advanced, it is but a question of time. Moreover, as already stated, human stature is little changed since the last glacial cycle. The giants of old are all buried under the oceans, and hundreds of thousands of years of constant friction by water would reduce to dust and pulverize a brazen, far more a human skeleton. But whence the testimony of well-known classical writers, of philosophers and men who, otherwise, never had the reputation for lying? Let us bear in mind, furthermore, that before the year 1847, when Boucher de Perthes forced it upon the attention of science, almost nothing was known of fossil man, for archaeology complacently ignored his existence. Of giants who were in the earth in those days of old, the Bible alone had spoken to the wise men of the West, the zodiac being the solitary witness called upon to corroborate the statement of the persons of Atlas or Orion, whose mighty shoulders are said to support the world, and neither of which are part of the zodiac. They are constellations, I will grant you that. Nevertheless, even the giants have not been left without their witnesses, and one may as well examine both sides of the question. The three sciences, geological, sidereal, and scriptural, the latter in its universal character, may furnish us with the needed proofs. To begin with, geology. It has already confessed that the older the excavated skeletons, the larger, taller, and more powerful their structure. This is already a certain proof in hand. All those bones, writes Frederick de Rougemont, who, though believing too piously in Noah's Ark and the Bible, is nonetheless a scientific witness. All those skeletons found in the departments of the God, in Australia, Liege, etc., etc., those skulls which remind all of the Negro type, and which, by reason of that type, might be mistaken for animals, have all belonged to men of very high stature. The same is repeated by Lartet, an authority who attributes a tall stature to those who were submerged in the deluge, not necessarily Noah's, and a smaller stature to the races which lived subsequently. As for the evidence furnished by ancient writers, we need not stop at that of Tertullian, who assures us that in his day a number of giants were found at Carthage, for before his testimony can be accepted, his own identity, footnote. There are critics who, finding no evidence about the existence of Tertullian save in the writings of Eusebius the Veracious, are inclined to doubt it. His own identity and actual existence would have to be proven, but we may turn to scientific journals of 1858, which spoke of a sarcophagus of giants found that year on the site of the same city. As to the ancient pagan writers, we have evidence of Philostratus, who speaks of a giant skeleton 22 cubits long, as well as of another of 12 cubits, seen by himself at Sigius. This skeleton may perhaps not have belonged, as believed by Protesilaus, to the giant killed by Apollo at the siege of Troy. Nevertheless, it was that of a giant, as well as that other one discovered by Mesocrates of Styr at Lemnos, horrible to behold, according to Philostratus. It is possible that prejudice would carry science so far as to class all these men as either fools or liars. Pliny speaks of a giant in whom he thought he recognized Orion, the son of Ephialtes. Plutarch declares that Sertorius saw the tomb of Antaeus, the giant, and Pausanias vouches for the actual existence of the tombs of Asterius and of Gyron, or Hylas, son of Hercules, all giants, titans, and mighty men. Finally, the Abbé Pigs affirms in his curious work on the volcanoes of Greece that, in the neighborhood of the volcanoes on the Isle of Terra, giants with enormous skulls were found laid out under colossal stones, the erection of which must have necessitated everywhere the use of titanic powers, and which tradition associates in all countries with the ideas about giants, volcanoes, and magic. In the same work above cited of the Abbé Piquis, the author wonders why in the Bible and tradition of the Gibborim, giants, the mighty ones, the Rephaim, or the specters, phantoms, the Nephilim, or the fallen ones, Eruntes, are shown as if identical, though they are all men, since the Bible calls them the primitive and mighty ones, e.g. Nimrod. The Doctrine explains the secret. These names, which belong by right only to the four preceding races and the earliest beginning of the fifth, allude very clearly to the first two phantom, astral, races, to the fallen one, the third, and to the race of the Atlantean giants, the fourth, after which men begin to decrease in stature. Bossuet sees the cause of subsequent universal idolatry in the original sin. Ye shall be as gods, says the serpent of Genesis to Eve, thus laying the first germ of the worship of false divinities. Hence, he thinks, came idolatry, or the cult and adoration of images, of anthropomorphized or human figures. But if it is the latter that idolatry is made to rest upon, then the two churches, the Greek and the Latin especially, are as idolatrous and pagan as any other religion. Yeah. Footnote. And that, notwithstanding the formal prohibition at the great Council of Elreus in AD 303, when it was declared that the form of God, which is immaterial and invisible, shall not be limited by figure or shape. In 692, the Council of Constantinople had similarly prohibited to paint or represent Jesus as a lamb, as also to bow the knee in praying, as it is the act of idolatry. But the Council of Nicaea brought this idolatry back, while that of Rome excommunicated John, the Patriarch of Constantinople, for his showing himself a declared enemy of image worship. It is only in the fourth race that men, who had lost all right to be considered divine, resorted to body worship, in other words, to phallicism. Till then, they had been truly gods, not true, as pure and as divine as their progenitors, false. And the expression of the allegorical serpent does not, as sufficiently shown in the preceding pages, refer at all to the physiological fall of men. That is true, but to their acquiring the knowledge of good and evil, which knowledge comes to them prior to their fall. It must not be forgotten that it is only after his forced expulsion from Eden that Adam knew Eve, his wife. It is not, however, by the dead letter of the Hebrew Bible that we shall check the tenets of the secret doctrine, but point out rather the great similarities between the two in their esoteric meaning. It is only after his defection from the Neoplatonists that Clement of Alexandria begins to translate gigantes by serpentes, explaining that serpents and giants signify demons. Genesis chapter 5, footnote. Treating of the Chinese dragon and the literature of China, Mr. C. Ch. Gold writes in his Mythical Monsters, its mythologies, histories, religions, popular stories, and proverbs all teem with references to a mysterious being who has a physical nature and spiritual attributes. Gifted with an accepted form, which he has the supernatural power of casting off for the assumption of others, he has the power of influence in the weather, producing droughts or fertilizing rains at pleasure, of raising tempests and allaying them. Volumes could be compiled from the scattered legends which everywhere abound relating to this subject. This mysterious being is the mythical dragon, an example, the symbol of the historical, actual adept, the master and professor of occult sciences of old. It is stated already elsewhere that the great magicians of the fourth and fifth races were generally called the serpents and the dragons, after their progenitors. All these belong to the hierarchy of the so-called fiery dragons of wisdom, the Dayan Kohans, answering to the Agnishwata Patris, the Maruts and Rudras generally, as the issue of Rudra, their father, identified with the god of fire. More is said in the text. Now, Clement, an initiated Neoplatonist, knew, of course, the origin of the word dragon, and why the initiated adepts were so called, as he knew the secret of Agathodemon, the Christ, the seven-vowed serpent of the Gnostics. He knew that the dogma of his new faith required the transformation of all the rivals of Jehovah, the angels, supposed to have rebelled against that, the Elohim, as the Titan Prometheus rebelled against Zeus, the usurper of his father's kingdom, and that dragon was the mystic appellation of the sons of wisdom. From this knowledge came his definition, as cruel as it was arbitrary. Serpents and giants signify demons, in example, not spirits, but devils, in church parlance. We may be told that, before we draw parallels between our tenets and those of the Bible, we have to show better evidence of the existence of the giants of the fourth race than the reference to them found in Genesis. We answered that the proofs we give are more satisfactory, at any rate they belong to a more literary and scientific evidence, than those of Noah's deluge will ever be. Even the historical works of China are full of such reminiscences about the fourth race. In Shu King, anyone can read in the French translation, when the mouse say, that antediluvian and perverted race, explains the annotator, which had retired in the days of old to the rocky caves, and the descendants of whom are still to be found in the neighborhood of Canton. Footnote 2. What would you say to our affirmation that the Chinese, I speak of the inland, the true Chinaman, not of the hybrid mixture between the fourth and fifth races now occupying the throne, the aborigines who belonged in their unallied nationality wholly to the highest and last branch of the fourth race, reached their highest civilization when the fifth had hardly appeared in Asia? And this handful of the inland Chinese are all of a very high stature. Could the most ancient manuscripts in the Lolo language, that of the aborigines of China, be got at and translated correctly, many a priceless piece of evidence would be found. But they are as rare as their language is intelligible. So far, 1 or 2 European archaeologists only have been able to procure such priceless works. When the Mao say, according to our ancient documents, had, owing to the beguilements of Chikiyu, troubled all the earth, it became full of brigands. The Lord Changti, a king of the divine dynasty, saw that his people had lost the last vestiges of virtue. Then he commanded Tehong and Li, 2 lower Dayan Kohans, to cut away every communication between heaven and earth. Since then there was no more going up and down. Footnote 2. How is that footnote 2? Did we miss a footnote? Huh. That's weird. Okay. Vide Supra, the commentary of the four races, and on the sons of will and yoga, the immaculate progeny of the androgynous third race. I think that is a misrepresentation. I think this is actually supposed to be footnote 1. Remember the same statement in the book of Enoch, as also the ladder seen by Jacob in his dream. See, it makes sense. The 2 worlds mean, of course, the 2 planes of consciousness and being. A seer can commune with beings of higher plane than the earth without quitting his armchair. Yeah, pretty much. Alright, no more going up and down. Going up and down means an untrammeled communication and intercourse between the 2 worlds. Not being in a position to give out a full and detailed history of the third and fourth races, as many isolated facts concerning them are as permitted must now be collated together, especially those corroborated by direct as well as inferential evidence found in ancient literature and history. As the coats of skin of men thickened, and they fell more and more into physical sin, the intercourse between physical and ethereal divine man was stopped. The veil of matter between the 2 planes became too dense for even the inner man to penetrate. The mysteries of heaven and earth, revealed to the third race by their celestial teachers in the days of their purity, became a great focus of light, the rays from which became necessarily weakened as they were diffused and shed upon an uncongenial, because too material soil. With the masses they degenerated into sorcery, taken later on the shape of exoteric religions, of idolatry full of superstitions and man, or hero worship. Alone a handful of primitive men, in whom the spark of the divine wisdom burnt bright, and only strengthened in its intensity as it got dimmer and dimmer with every age, and those who turned it to bad purposes, remained the elect custodians of the mysteries revealed to mankind by the divine teachers. There were those among them who remained in their chimeric condition from the beginning, and tradition whispers what the secret teachings affirm, namely, that these elect were the germ of a hierarchy which never died since that period. The inner man of the first footnote, this is going to be footnote 2, Veda Supra, the commentary on the four races and on the sons of will and yoga, the immaculate progeny of the androgynous third race. The inner man of the first only changes his body from time to time. He is ever the same, knowing neither rest nor nirvana, spurning Devachan and remaining constantly on earth for the salvation of mankind. Out of the 7 virgin men, Kumara, that says footnote 2, full sacrifice themselves for the sins of the world and the instruction of the ignorant. There is no footnote 3, so to remain till the end of the present Manvantara. Though unseen, they are ever present. When people say of one of them, he is dead, behold, he is alive and under another form. These are the head, the heart, the soul, and the seed of undying knowledge, Jnana. Thou shalt never speak, O Lenu, of these great ones, Maha, before a multitude, mentioning them by their names. The wise alone will understand. Footnote: Catechism of the Inner Schools. In the Kabbalah, the pronunciation of the four-lettered ineffable name is a most secret arcanum, a secret of secrets. It is these sacred four who have been allegorized and symbolized in the Lingua Purana, which states that Vamadeva, Siva, as Kumara, is reborn in each kalpa, race in this instance, as four youths, four white, four red, four yellow, and four dark or brown. Let us remember that Siva is preeminently and chiefly an ascetic, the patron of all yogis and adepts, and the allegory will become quite comprehensible. It is the spirit of divine wisdom and chaste asceticism itself which incarnates in these elect. It is only after getting married and being dragged by the gods from his terrible ascetic life that Rudra becomes Siva, a god, and not one of the very virtuous or merciful type in the Hindu pantheon. Higher than the four is only one on earth as in heavens, that still more mysterious and solitary being described in Book 1, or better, in my book. We have now to examine the nature of the sons of the flame and of dark wisdom, as well as the pros and cons of the satanic assumption. Such broken sentences as could be made out from the fragments on the tile, which George Smith calls the curse after the fall, see page 81 of his Chaldean account of Genesis, are of course allegorical, yet they corroborate that which is taught in the true nature of the fall of the angels in our books. Thus, it is said in line 12 that the Lord of the earth, his name called out the Father Elu, Elohim, and pronounced his curse, which the god Hea heard, and his liver was angry, because his man, angelic man, had corrupted his purity, 14 and 15, for which Hea expresses the desire that wisdom and knowledge hostilely may injure him, man. The latter sentence points to the direct connection of the Chaldean with the genetic account, while Hea tries to bring to naught the wisdom and knowledge gained by man. Through his newly acquired intellectual and conscious capacity of creating in his turn, thus taking the monopoly of creation out of the hands of God, the gods, the Elohim do the same in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Therefore, the Elohim sent him out of Eden. But this was of no avail, for the spirit of the divine wisdom being upon and in man, verily the serpent of eternity and all knowledge, that monastic spirit, which made him learn the secret of creation on the Kriyasatik and of procreation on the earthly planes, led him as naturally to discover his way to immortality, notwithstanding the jealousy of all the gods. The early Atlanto-Lemurians are charged with taking unto themselves, divine incarnations, wives of a lower race, namely, the race of the hitherto mindless men. Every ancient scripture has the same, more or less, disfigured legend. Primarily the angelic fall, which has transformed the firstborn of God into the Asuras, or into the Ahriman and Typhon of the pagans. In example, if the accounts given in the book of Enoch, footnote, returning once more to the most important subject in the archaic cosmogony, it may be said that even in the Norse legends, in the sacred skulls of the goddess Saga, we find Loki, the brother by blood of Odin, as Typhon, Ahriman, and others are blood of Osiris and Ormazd, becoming evil only later, when he is mixed too long with humanity. Like all other fire or light gods, fire burning and destroying as well as warming and giving life, he ended by being accepted in the destructive sense of fire. The name Loki, we learn, Asgard and the gods, has been derived from the word lichen, to enlighten. It has therefore the same origin as the Latin lux, light, since Loki is identical with Lucifer, light bringer. This title, given to the Prince of Darkness, is very suggestive and is a vindication in itself against theological slander. But Loki is still more closely related to Prometheus, as he is shown chained to a sharp rock, while Lucifer, identified with Satan, was chained down in hell, a circumstance, however, which prevented neither of them from acting in all freedom on earth, if we accept the theological paradox in its fullness. Loki is a beneficent, generous, and powerful god in the beginning of times, and the principle of good, not of evil, in early Scandinavian theogony. If the accounts given in the Book of Enoch and in Hermes, in Puranas and the Bible are taken literally, when read esoterically, means simply this. Sentences such as, in his, Satan's, ambition, he raises his hand against the sanctuary of the God of heaven, ought to read, prompted by the law of eternal evolution, and the angel incarnated on earth in man, and as his wisdom and knowledge are still divine, although his body is earthly, he is, allegorically, accused of divulging the mysteries of heaven. He combines and uses the two for purposes of human, instead of superhuman, procreation. Henceforth, men will beget, not create. Footnote 2. The Greek mythos just alluded to a few pages back, namely the mutilation of Uranos by his son Kronos in the Greek theogony, is an allusion to this theft by the son of the earth and heavens of the divine creative fire. If Uranos, the personification of the celestial powers, has to stop creating, he is made impotent by Kronos, the god in time. So, in the Egyptian cosmogony, it is Tehote, the god of wisdom, who regulates this fight between Horus and Set, the latter being served by the former as Uranos by Kronos. In the Babylonian account, it is the god Zu who strips the father of the gods of Usimi, the ideal creative organ, not the crown, as G. Smith thought. For, in the fragment K3454 of the British Museum, it is said very clearly that Zu, having stripped the venerable of heaven of his desire, he carried away the Umsimi of the gods, burnt thereby the Taroti, the power, of all the other gods, thus governing the seat of all the angels. As the Usimi was on the seat of Bel, it could hardly be the crown. A fourth version is in the Bible. Ham is the Chaldean Zu, and both are cursed for the same allegorically described crime. Now, if the Usimi was in the seat, it may not have been the crown, but it could have been the base. And I lost my spot. Hold on, I'll have to find it. There it is. But, as, by so doing, he has to use his weak body as the means of procreation, that body will pay the penalty for this wisdom, carried from heaven down to earth. Hence, the corruption of physical purity will become a temporary curse. The medieval Kabbalists knew this well, since one of them did not fear to write. The Kabbalah was first taught by God himself to a select company of angels, who formed a theosophic school in paradise. After the fall of the angels, most graciously communicated this heavenly doctrine to the disobedient child of earth, to furnish the protoplasm with the means of returning to their pristine nobility and felicity. Quoted by Christian Ginsburg from the Kabbalah. This shows how the event of these sons of God marrying and imparting the divine secrets of heaven to the daughters of men, allegorically told by Enoch in the 6th chapter of Genesis, was interpreted by the Christian Kabbalist. The whole of this period may be regarded as the pre-human period, that of divine man, or, as plastic Protestant theology now has it, the pre-Adamite period. But even Genesis begins its real history, chapter 6, by the giants of those days and the sons of God marrying and teaching their wives, the daughters of man. This period is the one described in the Puranas, and relating as it does to the days lost in archaic ages, hence prehistoric. How can any anthropologist feel certain whether the mankind of that period was or was not as he knows it now? The whole personnel of the Brahmanas and Puranas, the Rishis, Prajapatis, Manus, their wives and progeny, belong to that pre-human period. All these are the seed of humanity, so to speak. It is around these sons of God, the mind-born astral children of Brahma, that our physical frames have grown and developed to what they are now. For the Puranic histories of all those men are those of our monads, and their various and numberless incarnations on this and other spheres. Events perceived by the Siva eye of the ancient seers, the third eye of our stanzas, and described allegorically. Later on they were disfigured for sectarian purposes, mutilated, but still left with a considerable groundwork of truth in them. Nor is the philosophy less profound in such allegories for being so thickly veiled by the overgrowth of fancy. But with the fourth race we reach the purely human period, those who were hitherto semi-divine beings, self-imprisoned in bodies which were human only in appearance, became physiologically changed, and took unto themselves wives who were entirely human and fair to look at, but in whom lower, more material, though sidereal, beings had incarnated. These beings in female forms, Lilith is the prototype of these in Jewish traditions, are called in the esoteric accounts Kado, Dakini in Sanskrit. Allegorical legends call the chief of these Liliths Sangi Kado, Buddha Dakini in Sanskrit. All are credited with the art of walking in the air and the greatest kindness to mortals, but no mind, only animal instinct. Footnote. These are the beings whose legendary existence has served as a groundwork upon which to build the rabbinical Lilith, and what believers in the Bible would term the antediluvian women, and the Kabbalists the pre-Adamite races. They are no fiction, this is certain, however fantastic the exuberance of later growth. It is important to note that there is no reference to Lilith in the Bible. That is important. C. This is the beginning of a worship which, ages later, was doomed to degenerate into phallicism and sexual worship. It begins by the worship of the human body, that miracle of miracles, as an English author calls it, and ended by that of its respective sexes. The worshippers were giants in stature, but they were giants in knowledge and learning, though it came to them more easily than it does to the men of our modern times. Their science was innate in them. The Lemuro-Atlantean had no need of discovering and fixing in his memory that which his informing principle knew at the moment of its incarnation. Time alone, and the ever-growing obtuseness of the matter in which the principles had clothed themselves, could, the one, weaken the memory of their prenatal knowledge, the other, blunt and even extinguish every spark of the spiritual and divine in them. Therefore, had they, from the first, fallen victims to their animal natures and bred monsters, in example, men of distinct varieties from themselves. Speaking of the giants, Cruiser describes them well in saying that those children of heaven and earth were endowed at their birth by sovereign powers, the authors of their being, with extraordinary faculties both moral and physical. They commanded the elements, knew the secrets of heaven and the earth, of the sea and the whole world, and read futurity in the stars. It seems, indeed, as though one has to deal, when reading with them, not with men as we are, but with spirits of the elements sprung from the bosom of nature and having full sway over her. All these beings are marked with the character of magic and sorcery. Not all of them, right? The Bible, right, and let's go ahead and pause. The biblical references to the giants do not give them magic or sorcery at all, right? None of the accounts of the giants. Now, you can make the argument for the Noachian flood and how they were doing things, but those things are not described vividly at all. They are not intimated to be magic and sorcery, but some kind of a technology. Now, you can make the argument that technology and magic are inseparable, right? To bring back the infamous lighter example, if I had this and I went 6,000 years back in time and I pulled this out of my pocket, despite the fact that I am dressed completely different and my hair and my appearance is different, if I could do that, I am a god. That alone, the ability to just summon fire at will, makes me a god. But it's just technology. And the difference between technology and magic is blurry if you don't know about it, right? If you don't know about TVs, a TV is going to be an impressive thing. If you don't know about lights, lights are going to be impressive. You will be impressed by it. You will not understand it. It's the problem that we have with prophecy, as I talk about so many times. If I were to pull Isaiah from the Bible and sit him next to me, he would describe these things, not accurately, but to the best of his ability. It would be talking rocks and glowing stones. That would be how he could describe it. That would be the only concept that he would have. But you give me a year and no language barrier, and I can teach him to do this entire thing. I can teach him to use every bit of technology in the entirety of my house. He didn't have the opportunity to learn it previously, but he has the capacity to understand it if it is explained. But it's not explained, right? That's the problem with prophecy. You can only interpret it according to what you already know. And so a television is just some glowing rock. That is important to remember when we're talking about this. There is no record of giants performing magic in the Bible. There are intimations that they had some technology, which can be taken as the same thing, but is definitely not the same thing. The magic that I perform has nothing to do with technology. It is the manipulation of the Holy Spirit. It is a thing which is and works, but it has absolutely nothing to do with technology whatsoever. Back to the text. And so they were. Those, now legendary heroes of the prehistoric, still, once really existing races. Cruiser was wise in his generation, for he did not charge with deliberate deceit or dullness and superstition an endless series of recognized philosophers, who mention these races and assert that, even in their own time, they saw their fossils. There were skeptics in days of old, no fewer and as great as they are now. But even a Lucian, a Democritus, and an Epicurus yielded to the evidence of facts and showed the discriminative capacity of really great intellects, which can distinguish fiction from fact, and truth from exaggeration and fraud. Ancient writers were no more fools than our modern wise men are. For, as well remarked by the author of some, Notes on Aristotle's Psychology in relation to modern thought and mind. The common division of history into ancient and modern is misleading. The Greeks in the 4th century BC were in many respects moderns, especially, we may add, in their skepticism. They were not very likely to accept fables so easily. Yet the Lemurians and the Atlanteans, those children of heaven and earth, were indeed marked with a character of sorcery, for the esoteric doctrine charges them precisely with that. So, which, if believed, would put an end to the difficulties of science with regard to the origin of man, or rather, his anatomical similarities to the anthropoid ape. Now, I am unaware of the esoteric doctrine, right? That is part of why we are doing these, right? I was hoping to stumble across some of it, and there's a little bit been explained, but for the most part, it is a lot of this. Well, it's explained in places that I really can't tell you about. I mean, we've had a lot of that. But we have had some explanations. This, the Lemurians and Atlanteans, once again, there is zero evidence for Lemuria. There is one example of Atlantis. And so most of what she talks about in this are other people's extrapolations from that one reference or the no reference, right? She is quite literally creating whole cloth some of these things. And it is important to note, there are legends on every single continent, in every single country, on every single province of giants that they once existed. Some of them, they are beneficial giants. Some of them, they are detrimental giants. Most of the detrimental ones, however, are not ascribed sorcery. They're ascribed malevolence. By that I mean, they eat humans. That is malevolent. Not cannibalism, because they are different races. I don't believe in her third, fourth, fifth race bullshit. Right? It's possible, I just don't have reason to believe that. I do, however, have reason to believe that there were giants. There was evidence, although there is not evidence. There are two groups that are quite efficient at absorbing any evidence. One of those is the Catholic Church. If there is a discovery, the very first thing that happens is the Catholic Church sends somebody out to secure the situation. That has happened time and time again, not only with giants, but with paranormal experiences of a variety of natures, whether that is a statue bleeding from the eyes, or somebody with stigmata, or exorcism, or possession, or any of those things. The Catholic Church comes in and puts a kibosh on it real quick. The other group is the Smithsonian, and they don't do it for religious reasons that we know of, but rather to keep a certain direction on science, right? If this thing contradicts this other thing, they will disappear the thing that contradicts it. That has happened. The evidence of that is various news reports with photographic evidence of remains of these giants. Now, some of those remains can be explained away. You found these giant bones and you thought that they were human, but they actually weren't. They were some kind of a sloth, for instance. But some of them can't. Some of the photographic evidence that still exists today has a man standing next to the reassimilated skeletal structure of a being 18 feet tall. Well, the Smithsonian came in and took possession of those remains, and they never made it back to headquarters. That happened every single time. Now, some of those absolutely were fraudulent. I do not dismiss that at all. Some of them, however, were not. And if they were fraudulent, we would still have the remains, right? They would use that as an example of people trying to be fraudulent. What most likely happened to take away malevolence, what most likely happened was these people came in, and the people in charge of it was like, I know somebody that would buy these for an extraordinary amount of money. And so they wound up with that person who would pay the extraordinary amount of money, with the condition that it never comes to light. That is an absolute truth that has happened. Now, I cannot give you that evidence. It is not my evidence to give. I don't have it. I don't keep it, all of those things. But I've seen it. It is available. You can find it. It's out there. There are at least 2 mostly malevolent organizations hoping to keep truth from coming out. Now, why the Bible, right, the people who believe the Bible don't want the giants to be known about, that's a question you're going to have to ask yourself. I suggest you fall back to the Bible study. Now, back to the text. It accuses them of having committed, to us, abominable crime of breeding with so-called animals, and thus producing a truly pithecoid species, now extinct. Of course, as in the question of spontaneous generation, in which the esoteric science believes and which it teaches, the possibility of such a crossbreed between man and an animal of any kind will be denied. That is true for me as well. If you are unaware, if this is the first time that you've watched one of my videos, I do not believe in macroevolution. I believe in change within the species, I do. But I do not believe that there was a gradual change brought about spontaneously between species. There are a number of reasons why I do not believe that, but genetic viability is definitely one of those. We've made the argument many times, but here it is again. If you have a pod of apes and one ape is born different, right? Say hairless, and you have standing there 2 or 3 apes, right? 2 of them are normal and one of them is the anomaly. Which one is going to be picked to spread the genes? It's not going to be the anomaly, and if you think that, you're wrong, right? We as humans have a tendency to pick the defect more than any other species on the planet. Any other species on the planet will allow the defect to not breed. We don't do that. That is one of the problems with humanity and why stupidity is so overwhelming. It's because stupid people breed. But in the animal kingdom, if you're dumb, you don't breed. If you are genetically different, you don't breed, right? For the most part, albinos don't get to breed in the wild. Right? Some of them do due to various factors, but for the most part, as a rule, albinos don't breed. They are not selected for continuation. The same would be true of this one hairless ape that would be required, right? But if there was something that caused a spontaneous generation, and by that I mean specifically nuclear, right? This is the formulation that can work. I'm not saying that this is the way that it happened, but this is how it could have happened. We know that the sun emits radiation. That is undeniable. Even you can't deny that. We know that it varies in the levels of radiation that it gives. That is a truth. That is undeniable. There are periods by which the sun emits massive amounts of radiation. This can come from sunspots, this can come from coronal mass ejections, and a variety of other things along that nature. Every once in a while, the sun sends off a large blast of radiation in that direction, or that direction, whichever direction. At one point, it is entirely possible that it sent it in our direction, and that as this energy either passed over the Earth or just right by the Earth, that it affected some genetic mutations in the species which were here. In that case, there would be spontaneous mutation of the species at the moment of gestation, or even the continuation of the species would be all the genetic mutations, right? If all of a sudden this entire pod is giving birth to hairless apes, then there is a biological imperative to choose the hairless apes. But if there is only a single hairless ape, no female is going to choose that single hairless ape. It goes against genetics. That animal would be less likely to survive. It's going to get hot and cold faster. It's going to not be able to maintain its body heat in a way that is going to be conducive to continuation. That is biologically not imperative for continuation. But if it happened to everybody at once, now there is a reason. That is my theory on how the evolutionary process happened. Repeatedly. It doesn't have to have been a single instance. It could have been many, right? It could have been one instance that made the amoeba turn into a multicellular animal, and another one that would take the fish out of the water. All of a sudden, none of these fish can breathe water. They come out of the fucking water, right? Spontaneous mutation. There is reason to believe that this is possible. You can look at Chernobyl, the research that they are doing with wolves right now. There have been spontaneous genetic mutations due to nuclear radiation evident in the wild. We can study it. My theory makes more sense than Darwin. It makes more sense than Mrs. Blavatsky. Either one. Back to the text. But apart from the consideration that in those early days, as already remarked, neither the human Atlantean giants nor yet the animals were the physiologically perfect men and mammalians that are now known to us, the modern notions of this subject, those of the physiologist included, are too uncertain and fluctuating to permit them an absolute denial a priori of such fact. A careful perusal of the commentaries would make one think that the being that the new incarnate bred with was called an animal, not because he was no human being, but rather because he was so dissimilar, physically and mentally, to the more perfect races, which had developed physiologically at an earlier period. Remember stanza 7 and what is said in its first verse, 24th, that when the sons of wisdom came to incarnate the first time, some of them incarnated fully, others projected into the forms only a spark, while some of the shadows were left over from being filled and perfected, till the fourth race. Those races, then, which remained destitute of knowledge, or those again which were left mindless, remained as they were, even after the natural separation of the sexes. It is these who committed the first crossbreeding, so to speak, and bred monsters. And it is from the descendants of these that the Atlanteans chose their wives. Adam and Eve were supposed, with Cain and Abel, to be the only human family on earth. Yet we see Cain going to the land of Nod and taking there a wife. Evidently, one race only was supposed perfect enough to be called human. Or this group of people who were trying to distinguish themselves chose to take the story for themselves and to elevate themselves into the one race. I do not believe that there was a chosen race. I do not believe that there ever will be a chosen race. I do believe that some people can be chosen, but that is due to dedication and service and not anything that they necessarily choose externally for that, right? The people who would be chosen would not be doing it to be chosen, but simply because they wanted to do it. And so there is an alternate explanation. And again, I do not take the Bible to be the definitive answer for pretty much anything. Evidently, only one race was supposed perfect enough to be called human. And even in our own day, while the Sinhalese regard the Vedas of their jungles as speaking animals and no more, some British people believe firmly, in their arrogance, that every other human family, especially the dark Indians, is an inferior race. Speak for yourself, Mrs. Blavatsky. Remember what you were saying about those aboriginals in Australia? I remember what you said. Moreover, there are naturalists who have sincerely considered the problem whether some savage tribes, like the Bushmen, for instance, can be regarded as men at all. The commentary says, in describing that species, or race of animals, fair to look at as a biped, having human shape but having the lower extremities, from the waist down, covered with hair, hence the race of satyrs, perhaps. If men existed 2 million years ago, they must have been, just as the animals were, quite different physically and anatomically from what they have become, and they were nearer then to the type of pure mammalian animal than they are now. Anyhow, we learn that the animal world breeds strictly inter se, in example, in accordance with genus and species. Yeah, that's my argument. only since the appearance on this earth of the Atlantean race. That is not. As demonstrated by the author of that able work, Modern Science and Modern Thought, this idea of the refusal to breed with another species, or that sterility, is the only result of such breeding, appears to be a prima facie deduction rather than an absolute law, even now. He shows that different species do, in fact, often breed together, as may be seen in the familiar instance of the horse and ass. It is true that in this case the mule is sterile, but this rule is not universal. And recently one new hybrid race, that of the leporine, or hare rabbit, has been created which is perfectly fertile. The progeny of wolf and dog is also instanced, and that of several other domestic animals, like foxes and dogs, again, and this modern Swiss cattle shown by Rudemeyer as descended from 3 distinct species of foxal oxen, the Bos primigenius, Bos languerfon, and Bos frontosus. Yet some of those species, as the ape family, which so clearly resembles man in physical structure, contain, we are told, numerous branches which graduate one into another, but the extremes of which differ more widely than man does from the highest of the ape series, the gorilla and chimpanzee, for instance. See addenda. Thus, Mr. Darwin's remark, or shall we say the remark of Linnaeus, Natura non facit saltum, is not only corroborated by esoteric science, but would, were there any chance of the real doctrine being accepted by any others than its direct votaries, reconcile in more than one way, if not entirely, the modern evolutionary theory with facts, as also with the absolute failure of the anthropologists to meet with the missing link in our 4th round geological formations. We will show elsewhere that, however unconsciously to itself, modern science pleads our case upon its own admissions, and that Quatrefages is perfectly right when he suggests in his last work that it is far more likely that the anthropoid ape should be discovered to be the descendant of man than that the 2 types should have a common fantastic and nowhere to be found ancestor. Thus, the wisdom of the compilers of the old stanzas is vindicated by at least one eminent man of science, and the occultist prefers to believe, as he ever did, that man was the first and highest mammalian animal that appeared in this 4th round creation. Then came still huger animals, and last of all the dumb man who walks on all 4s. For the Rakshasas, giant demons, and Daityas, titans, of the White Dweepa continent, spoiled his, the dumb man's, sires. Furthermore, as we see, there are anthropologists who have traced man back to an epoch which goes far to break down the apparent barrier that exists between the chronologies of modern science and the archaic doctrine. It is true that English scientists generally have declined to commit themselves to the sanction of the hypothesis of even a tertiary man. They, each and all, measure the antiquity of Homo primigenius by their own lights and prejudices. Huxley, indeed, ventures to speculate on a possible Pliocene or Miocene man. Professor Seaman and Mr. Grant Allen have relegated his advent to the Eocene, but generally speaking, English scientists consider that we cannot safely go beyond the Quaternary. Unfortunately, the facts do not accommodate the too cautious reserve of these latter. The French school of anthropology, basing their views on the discoveries of l'Abbé Bourgeois, Capellini, and others, has accepted almost without exception the doctrine that the traces of our ancestors are certainly to be found in the Miocene, while Monsieur de Quatrefages now inclines to postulate a secondary age man. Further on, we shall compare such estimates with the figures given in the Brahmanical exoteric books which approximate to the esoteric teaching. D. Then, the third eye acted no longer, says the stanza, because man had sunk too deep into the mire of matter. What is the meaning of this strange and weird statement in verse 42 concerning the third eye of the race which had died and acted no longer? That's because we forgot how to flex it. I know how. I've given instructions in the book that is linked down below. It's also available freely on the channel, but I'm not going to give it to you today. A few more occult teachings must now be given with reference to this point, as well as some others. The history of the third and fourth races must be amplified in order that it may throw some more light on the development of our present humanity and show how the faculties called into activity by occult training restore man to the position he previously occupied in reference to spiritual perception and consciousness. But the phenomena of the third eye has to be first explained. And that is going to bring us to the end of our Giants of Fiction. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. I understand I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but I don't apologize for it. It is important to maintain where truth lies and where speculation lies. Now, my theory of evolution is entirely speculative. It is based upon factual probabilities, but I don't have any archaeological evidence to prove that my version is correct. And so, it remains speculation, even though it is, in my estimation, a lot more probable for the reasons that I outlined. Darwin was speculating. Einstein was speculating. Newton was speculating. Every major person of science has been speculating up until the point where they got the ability to prove themselves. Maybe one day we'll be able to prove the spontaneous mutation due to extrasolar problems. Maybe not. But until then, it is a good working theory. It works a lot better than this normal gorilla saw this gorilla who was completely abnormal and said, you know what, that looks like a good piece, let's lay it. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that was said here. Put it in the box down below, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is another work you would like to see me discuss or just read in the manner that we are doing here, drop that in the box as well. And if you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks. Give me a membership or check out my book provided at the link below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pit State. Peace.